to start somewhere, and hopefully we'll get some insight. So there's the stories are about, I didn't send the link. You know what? Let me share the link, and then I'll share the screen in a minute. But before I share the screen, I'll post a link if anybody wants to share it. How do we do this? Chat, everyone. This is the link to the Haftorah. I'm going to share it on the screen momentarily, but if you want to see it and print it out or whatever, you can look at it. It's a story about Elisha the prophet, who's the disciple and the successor of Eliyahu. And what happens is we hear about two miracles in this Haftorah. One miracle is that there's a poor woman who comes to Elisha. She says, I have no money. My husband died. And the creditor wants to take my servants, my children as slaves. Oh, God. Excuse me. As slaves. Elisha asks her, no, what do you have at home? She says, I have nothing. I just have a little bit of oil. So Elisha says, gather all the jugs of oil and start pouring the oil into the empty jugs. Get as many empty jugs as you can. And miraculously, the jugs fill with oil, and she has enough money to pay back the creditor and live with the extra money. That's the first story. The next story is Elisha. There was a woman who recognized that Elisha was a holy man. So she said, why don't you, whenever you're passing by, why don't you come and stay in our house? She made him a little room, and Elisha was grateful. And Elisha asks her, what do you need? Do you need anything from the king? She says, no, I don't need much. I'm within my, literally she says, I live within my people, meaning I get along with people, I'm fine. I don't really need much. But then Elisha's helper, whose name was Gehazi, says, the woman does not have a child. So Elisha gives her a blessing that she should have a child. She has a child. Then what happens is the child grows up. He goes out to his father in the field. He has a headache. He dies. Now she's upset. So what does she do? She goes to the prophet, and there's this whole back and forth. The prophet tries to send his helper Gehazi to see what he can do with his staff. Gehazi is unsuccessful in doing anything. Finally, Elisha has to show up, and Elisha locks the door, puts himself on top of the baby, on top of the child, his mouth on his mouth, and 7 times does mouth to mouth, and the child is revived. That's the story. So we want to think about what's the connection to the parsha, what's the message of the story, and if we have some time, we'll also think about the characters of what this story tells us, because it's really drawn out. So we're going to think about the character development. How does the woman change in the story? How does Elisha change in the story? So there's a lot of to talk about within the realm of just the story, and then there's also the first story has a lot of Kabbalah to it as well. So we'll do a little bit of Kabbalah and a little bit of reading the characters of the story. So that's the introduction. If anybody has any comments or questions, please go ahead. What is the connection to the par? Okay, let me share the screen, and then we'll start thinking about the connection to the parsha.
Rabbi, is this the only week that we have those parshas?
These stories as the Haftorah?
The stories, right.
This story, yeah. There are other stories. If you remember, we did the story with David and Jonathan, and next week we're going to do the story of when David's about to pass away. So you have some stories. Most of the Haftorahs are not stories. Most of the Haftorahs are the prophecies from the early prophets, from Isaiah, from Ezekiel, etc., Jeremiah, etc. But once in a while we get a story, and this is a story from the book of Kings, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, Kings 2, chapter 4. Yeah.
So, but that's the only week in a year that we have those.
These specific stories, yes. Whoops.
Okay.
These specific stories, yes. This is the only day we have these specific stories. Okay. what is the connection between these stories and the parsha? So what the parsha there's so many details we can think about. The parsha talks about, what does the parsha talk about? The parsha obviously talks about Abraham and Sarah, and it emphasizes the concept of kindness. Abraham was obviously kind. He has his tent, and the opening scene of the parsha is that Abraham is waiting to greet guests. There aren't any guests, and he's very troubled by the fact that there are no guests. And Abraham is waiting to feed the guests. This Haftorah also emphasizes kindness. In the second story, we read about the woman who took Elisha into her home and gave him a place to stay, etc. The first story, it doesn't say explicitly where the kindness is, but the backstory, the Medrash, tells us where the kindness is. So I'll give you the backstory. The backstory, according to the Medrash, is as follows. Elisha was the successor of Elijah. And Elijah lived in the time of a very terrible Jewish king. In other words, not the king of Judah, but the king of Israel. His name was Achav. He had a terrible wife, a wicked wife named Isabel. And they tried to get rid of and kill all the prophets because the king doesn't like prophets. Certainly a corrupt king doesn't like prophets, because the prophet's job is to stand up to corruption and tell the king how terrible he is. So the king, but because of the urging of his wife, primarily his wife actually, they have they try to get all the prophets killed. There is a gentleman who works for the king, and his name is Ovadia. And this Ovadia fellow, he hides many of the prophets, hides them outside of town, and he keeps feeding them, and he supports them for many years. And the Medrash says that he runs out of money. After he runs out of money, he depletes all his savings to help to support the prophets. At that point, he goes to the king's son, and he asks the king's son for a loan. And eventually, this fellow passes away, Ovadia, and he doesn't have money to pay back the creditor. Who's the creditor? The son of the wicked king and queen. Now, the creditor wants to come and take the children of Ovadia, who was the one who did this great kindness to spare the prophets, take them as slaves because he couldn't pay back the debt. So now she runs to Elisha. Now we understand why Elisha is making this unbelievable miracle just to support a woman who needs a check. If a woman needs some help, go to Shul, make an appeal, and raise some cash. Why do you need this extraordinary miracle? So the Medrash seems to say that the extraordinary miracle is because it's an extraordinary woman, because she's in the family of the extraordinary kindness that Ovadia performed. So that's one interpretation. The connection between this story and the Parsha is it's the repayment for the amazing kindness, emphasizing the theme of chesed, of kindness. That's one angle. Once we get to the second story is very similar to the Parsha, because in this Parsha we hear about Sarah being told that she's going to have a child, because we read about the three guests that come to Abraham, and one of them tell them to tell Sarah that next year he's coming back and Sarah's going to have a child. And Sarah doesn't really believe it. She laughs, and eventually she has the child. And there's a lot of parallels to the story of Elisha, because Elisha tells the woman in a very similar language as the Torah, almost the exact same words. He says, "And next year you're going to be holding a son," almost the exact same words that the angel tells Sarah. And just like Sarah didn't believe it, with this woman called the Isha HaShunamit, the woman from Shunam, not that she doesn't believe it, but you will see she doesn't. She says, "Don't make a mockery." She doesn't really believe it either. That's another parallel. And then one more final thing is that both Sarah's son Isaac, at the end of the parsha, there's a challenge to Isaac's son, to Sarah's son, Isaac, the child born by miracle. What's the challenge in our parsha? The challenge is he's almost killed by the binding of Isaac. And what's the challenge of the Haftorah? The child dies. And both cases, they're miraculously revived, either by God's commandment to Abraham not to slaughter his son, or by the miracle through Elisha. So that's just some of the connections. And now we could start getting into the specific details. Now the question is, are you more interested in the Kabbalah or are you more interested in the story? Because we can take this in at least two angles. Let's do a few minutes of the Kabbalah. So I'm going to read the story. The first story is relatively short. The first story is 7 verses. I will read it inside, and then I'm going to give you the Kabbalistic reading. So this is Kings 2, chapter 4. Now a woman of the wives of the disciples of the prophets. In other words, there were disciples of the prophets, and she is one of the wives of the disciples of the prophets. Cried out to Elisha, saying, "Your servant, my husband, had died. And you know that your servant did fear the Lord, and the creditor has come to take my children for himself as a slave." And Elisha said to her, "What shall I do for you? Tell me what you have in the house." And she said, "Your maidservant has nothing at all in the house except a jug of oil." And he said, "Borrow vessels for yourself from outside, from all your neighbors. Do not borrow only a few empty vessels. In other words, don't borrow a few, borrow many. Get many empty vessels. And you shall come and close the door about yourself," in other words, behind yourself, "and about your sons. And you shall pour upon all these vessels, and the full one you shall carry away." And she went away from him and closed the door about herself and about her sons. They were bringing vessels to her, and she was pouring. So the sons keep giving vessels of oil, of empty vessels to the woman. She keeps pouring from her jug. It's like the Hanukkah miracle. More and more oil appears. Verse 6, and it was when the vessels were full that she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel." And he said to her, "There is no other vessel." And the oil stopped. So the oil responded to the vessels. If you don't make a vessel, you have no oil. And she came and told the man of God, and he said, "Go sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your sons will live with the remainder." You'll have enough money to pay back the debt and live with the extra. That's the conclusion of the first story. And then verse 8 begins the second story of the woman of Shunam. So what do we do with the story? We spoke about the kindness. We gave you the backstory of why this woman was why Elisha performs this great miracle for this woman. But now we want to look at the Kabbalistic interpretation. The Kabbalistic interpretation is as follows.
Rabbi, before we get into that, I mean, the story is so Kabbalistic because all Kabbalah is about vessels and energy.
Correct.
So it makes me wonder about the timing of it. So the Kabbalah wasn't verbalized at that point yet.
Correct. It was hidden. It was concealed. It wasn't. I mean, the earliest book of the Kabbalah, the Sefer Yetzirah, is attributed to either Rabbi Akiva or to Moshe. But yeah, the concepts weren't very well known at all. Correct. But again,
so the book of formation is not Abraham. It's
we're not sure exactly who wrote it. It's attributed to Abraham. Did Abraham actually write it, or did Abraham convey the ideas that were there? I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Do we know if Elisha was one of the prophets that this man protected?
I don't know if he hid. I don't know. I don't know that Elisha was well known as a prophet. If you read the story, how Elisha becomes a prophet, basically Elijah sees him working in the field, and basically Elijah recruits him. So I have to go check. I have to confess, I don't know exactly. I don't think he was one of the people that were well-known prophets that Izebel was pursuing.
Thank you.
But I would have to double check. Okay. Let's do some Kabbalah. Now a woman. Who's a woman? Woman is the soul. Who's the man? The man is God, because man and woman is like God and the Jewish people. So the word Elisha literally means Elisha, which is the name of the prophet, means Eli, my God, shall listen. So listen to my God. The woman, the soul is crying out to God. What is she saying? Avdecha ishi mate. Your servant, my husband, died, and the creditor wants to take my two sons as servants. Okay? What is she saying? Who died? Who died? Ishi, my husband, is also my fire. The soul comes down into this world, and when the soul was in heaven, the soul has a passionate love for God, and the soul tells God, now in this world, the fire, the passion to godliness has dissipated. It died. It's not here because we're involved in the physical world, and everything we do is through the consciousness of the body and the animal soul. So that the fire died. Now the creditor wants to take my two sons as slaves. So what is sons? What is children according to the Kabbalah? According to the Kabbalah, children are emotions. The intelligence is the parents. Chachma bina, wisdom and understanding, is father and mother. And the children, the midot, the emotional attributes, are considered the children. So what does she say? She says, my husband died. Literally, my fire died. So again, a woman, the soul, cries out to Elisha, cries out to God, and he says, my servant, my fire died. And the creditor, the evil inclination, wants to take my children, which is my capacity for love and awe that was originally directed toward God. And my creditor, my evil inclination, wants to use my attributes of love and fear, love and awe, to serve him. In other words, for material pursuits. That's the story of the soul coming into the body. I used to have passion to God. The passion dissipates. I have the capacity to love and fear, but the evil inclination wants to take it for negativity. What does Elisha say? What do you have? She says, I have nothing except for a little bit of oil. According to the Kabbalah, oil is chachma. Oil is the kernel of wisdom. According to the Kabbalah, oil represents the essence of the soul, that no matter how far a person turns away from godliness, that core of his soul is always loyal to God, and that's the little bit of oil. So now Elisha says, we know your core is good. Now the question is, how do we once again get your children back and get love and awe to God? So this is what Vicky alluded to. Kabbalah, empty vessels. What is empty vessels? So what is a vessel? According to the Kabbalah, every mitzvah we do is a vessel, because every mitzvah we do is a container to bring holiness into the world. The problem is it's an empty vessel. Why is it an empty vessel? Why is it empty? It's empty because it has no inspiration. The person says, I can do a mitzvah, but my mitzvah is empty because it's not infused with passion. Why no passion? Because my passion died. Because the evil inclination wants to take my passion for physical and worldly matters, not for God. So I can do a mitzvah, but I have empty vessels. So what does Elisha tell her? Gather as many empty vessels as you can. In other words, do as many mitzvot, even if the mitzvah you don't feel passion in performing the mitzvah. But because you have the oil within yourself, within your core, you have that oil, and you have the vessel. So just by doing the mitzvah, that will elicit the oil from the core of your soul, and that oil will spill over into your vessels. In other words, there's no such thing as uninspired action, because action inspires inspiration. If I'm not a kind person, but I keep doing acts of kindness, that's going to elicit within me the feeling of kindness. So that's the secret here. The secret here is kelim reikim al tamiti. Do not, that's verse 3. Do not minimize the empty vessels. Don't underestimate empty vessels. Don't underestimate uninspired action, because the uninspired action, you have the inspiration. Everybody has a little bit of oil, but that little bit of oil is going to spill over. And eventually he can pay off his debt and get his children back and live with the leftovers. So that is the story from the Kabbalistic perspective. If anybody has any comments, we could take it. Otherwise, we have another few minutes. Now we want to get to the second half of the story. We're going to move away from the Kabbalah and think about the analysis of the character transformation that happens within Elisha and within the woman, and it's a different angle. It's not as mystical, but it's perhaps interesting. So that's the story in short. There's a beautiful discourse from the Rebbe on this, based on a discourse from Rabbi Shneur Zalman, which is the first Chabad Rebbe, which is where I took this from. It goes line by line, explains every concept. What's the woman? The woman is the soul, et cetera, and how everything fits like a glove. And that's why it's an absolutely beautiful story from the Kabbalistic perspective. So that is the conclusion of part one of our Haftorah. And now we move to the second story, which is from verse 8 and on. But if anybody wants to make any comments or share anything, please go ahead. Otherwise, we continue. Okay, let's figure out how long this Haftorah is. Whoops, 37. I think we're not going to have a choice but to read it all because we have to get the feeling. So I'll try to read this as fast as I could. Verse 8. So give me 2-3 minutes. We'll read the whole Haftorah, and then we start thinking about the details. And it was that day that Elisha went as far as Shunem, and there was a prominent woman who prevailed upon him to eat a meal. And it was whenever he would pass, he would stop there and eat a meal. And she said to her husband, behold, now I know that he is a holy man of God who passes by us regularly. Now let us make a small walled upper chamber and place there for him a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp. And it will be that when he comes to us, he will turn into there. She says, let's make an attic and let's make a place for the prophet to stay. And it was one day that he went there, the prophet came there, and he turned into the upper chamber and he lay down. And he, the prophet, Elisha, said to Gehazi, his servant, call the Shunamitess woman. And he called her, and she stood before him. And he said to him, please say to her, behold, you have busied yourself on our account with all this trouble. What is there to do for you? In other words, you did so much for us. You took so much trouble to take care of the prophet. What could we do for you? Can we speak on your behalf to the king or to the general of the army? Do you need to pull any connections? And she said, I dwell in the midst of my people. Meaning, I don't need to know the prominent people. I don't need to know the general or the king. I'm with the common people. I'm okay. I have what I need. And he said, now what can we do for her? And Gehazi said, indeed, she has no son and her husband is old. So the servant of the prophet gives him this vital information. The woman doesn't say, I need a child. It's the servant who says so. And he said, summon her. And he summoned her, and she stood at the doorway. By the way, that phrase, the woman has no son and her husband is old, is literally almost a copy exactly what Sarah says in our parsha, Adoni Zakein, I have no son and my husband is old. So that's just a similarity. Verse 16, and he said, at this time next year, when you will be alive like now, you will be embracing a son. And she said, no, my Lord, O man of God, do not fail your maidservant. In other words, she says, Techazeb means don't make a mockery, don't lie, don't make a mockery of me. And the woman conceived and bore a son at this time, a year later, which Elisha has spoken to her. And the child grew up, and it was one day that he went out to his father to the reapers. And he said to his father, my head, I have a headache. And he said to the servant, carry him to his mother. And he carried him and brought him to his mother. And he sat on her knees until noon, and he died. So what did she do? She has this child miraculously born. She didn't really ask for him, but now that he's born, and now he dies in her lap. She went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, and she closed about him and left. She closed the door behind her and left. And she called her husband and said, please send me one of the servants and one of the she-asses, and I will run up to the man of God and return. And he said, why are you going to him today? It is neither the new moon nor the Sabbath. It's not the new month. It's not Rosh Chodesh, and it's not Shabbat. Why are you going to the prophet? And she said, all is right. Shalom. She says, peace. Everything is fine. She doesn't tell her husband what's going on. And she saddles the she-ass, and she said to her servant, drive and go forward. Don't keep back from riding because of me, unless I tell you. And she went and came to the man of God to Mount Carmel. And it was when the man of God saw her from afar that he said to the Gehazi, his servant, here is the Shunamitess. So the prophet sees her from a distance. He tells the servant, here, look who's coming. Now, please run toward her and say to her, are you well? Is your husband well? Is your child well? And she said, we are well. So the prophet sends his servants. She doesn't want to speak to the servant. She wants to speak to the prophet. Verse 27, and she came to the man of God to the mountain, and she took hold of his feet. And Gehazi approached to push her away. It wasn't polite that the woman is holding the prophet's feet. Now the man of God said, let her be, for her soul is bitter to her. And this is very powerful. And the Lord hid it from me and did not tell me. The prophet is surprised. Why don't I know what's going on here? How come I don't have insight to know what's bothering the woman? And she said, did I ask for a son from my Lord? Did I not say, do not mislead me? Meaning to say, she tells him what happened, and she says, why did you give me a son? I didn't ask for a son. And he said to Gehazi, gird your loins and take my staff in your hand and go. If you meet anyone, do not greet him. And if anyone greets you, do not answer him. And you shall place my staff on the lad's face. And the lad's mother said, as the Lord lives, and by your life I will not leave you. And he rose and went after her. She makes a promise. As the Lord lives is a promise. And she says, I'm not leaving here. 31, and Gehazi went ahead of them, and he placed the staff on the lad's face. And there was no sound nor any attention. And he returned toward him and told him, saying, the lad has not awakened. Gehazi comes back and tells the prophet, the lad has not awakened. Verse 32, and Elisha came into the house, and behold, the lad was dead, laid out on his bed. Verse 33, and he came and closed the door about both of them, and he prayed to the Lord. And he went up and lay on the child, and placed his mouth on his mouth, and his eyes on his eyes, and his palms on his palms. And he prostrated himself upon him, and the child's flesh became warm. And he returned and walked in the house once here and once there. And he went up and prostrated himself upon him. And the lad sneezed up 7 times, and the lad opened his eyes. And he summoned Gehazi and said, call the Shunammitess. And he called her, and she came to him, and he said, pick up your son. And she came and fell at his feet and bowed to the ground, and she picked up her son and departed. That's the miracle. That's the story. Now the question is what we do with the story. This story has many questions. We could start with the questions. The story emphasizes that, first of all, why did the child die? You would expect the child that was a miracle from God. The woman was older, and the prophet promised that she would live. No, have to be quiet, John. The prophet promised that she would live, and the prophet promised her a miraculous child, and all of a sudden the child dies. How come? That's one important question. Another important question is, why does it take Elisha so much time to figure out what happened? And Elisha himself is surprised. One of the most surprising verses in the story is that Elisha is surprised. And he says, Hashem hid this from me. I don't know what happened. So it's interesting that he's surprised.
Can that have possibly anything to do with the woman not wanting the child?
Yes, it must be connected. Yes. Yes. So there's many angles to address this story if you want to look at just the plot and things. So I'm looking at a contemporary rabbi, and so everything I say is primarily more contemporary. It's not necessarily as traditional as the other things we say, but I'm putting it out here. Take it or leave it, and you can decide if you like it. So we start the journey. The first thing we understand is that the woman does not ask for the child. Vicky noticed that, and Vicky said that we're not even sure if she wants the child. When she gets, look, if you really wanted a child, if somebody really wanted a child, and the prophet comes and says, what do you want? She should say, I want a child. But she doesn't say it. Why doesn't she say it? She doesn't want a child. Why doesn't she want a child? Maybe because she gave up hope. Maybe because she's too busy doing other things. The fact of the matter is, she doesn't ask for it. Now, Who gives the information to Elisha? Elisha's lad, Elisha's helper, Gehazi, his servant. And Gehazi says, this woman has no child. So what does Elisha said? He gives her a promise that she should have a child, and she didn't ask for it. Now the question is that a good idea or a bad idea? Is it a good idea to impose a blessing on somebody, even if it's objectively a good blessing, but is it a good idea to impose a blessing on somebody if they are not ready to receive it? And maybe the answer is that it is not a good idea. In other words, you have to give a blessing, but you have to give a blessing in a way where the person would be willing and capable of receiving it and appreciating it. And the theory goes as follows. The theory is that what you see, the reason why the child doesn't survive and the reason why the child dies, perhaps, is because the woman does not thank God for a miracle. And what you see in the Torah clearly that often when God intercedes and performs a miracle, God expects people to offer thanksgiving. And there's no thanksgiving is a problem. The Talmud goes as far and says that there was a battle with Sancheir, the king of Assyria, and God spared Jerusalem on the night of Passover. And there was a great king named Chizkiyahu. And the Talmud says that God wanted to make Chizkiyahu the Messiah. In other words, that was supposed to be the end of times, and that was supposed to be the end of. In other words, at that point, the Jewish people would have an ultimate victory, and everything would be good at that time. From that time and on, the problem was Chizkiyahu did not thank God for the miracle. So we have precedent that if you don't thank God for the miracle, that's a problem. Now, why did she not thank God for a miracle? Because she was a bad person? No, she didn't thank God for the miracle because she didn't ask for the miracle, right? The whole thing was superimposed. It was premature. And therefore, because she didn't ask for it, she didn't appreciate it, or she didn't feel that there's no expression of thanksgiving whatsoever, as opposed to this parsha, for example, when you have Sarah who wants a child, and Sarah wants a child, and what does she do when they have a children? So Avram makes a whole party. And Sarah sings poetry. Sarah says, "Mimi lel Avraham." Who could imagine that Avram had a child and Sarah is nursing children? There's a clear feeling of exuberance and excitement. Why? Because they wanted it. Here, it seems like the interaction was premature. You're giving somebody a tremendous blessing. As a prophet, you think you're doing the right thing, but sometimes you have to make sure that the person is in the state of mind to be able to receive this blessing, and they have to want it. And if they don't want it, if they don't feel the lack, then they may not actually be in the state of mind of feeling thankful for the blessing. And if you're not thankful for the blessing, you may lose the blessing. Now let's get to the other half of the story. Again, we still have other things to focus, but let's think about the woman, transformation in the woman. In the beginning of the story, when the prophet says, "I'm going to give you a child," she is passive. Not only she's passive, she doesn't want it. She says, "Al tachazev, don't make a mockery of me." Right? She's not demanding. The second half of the story, she directly goes. She's very assertive. She goes straight to the prophet. The prophet, she doesn't send anybody. She doesn't send her husband. The prophet sends the prophet's servant, Gehazi. She doesn't want Gehazi. She makes the prophet himself come to her house. She's much more assertive and much more active, and she insists that the prophet help her. That's the correction. That's what she didn't have the first time around. Now, when the child came to life again, now she appreciates it. Now she thanks God. Now she's in the state of mind where she wants the blessing and she's capable of receiving the blessing. So that's one element. That's from the perspective of the woman. Now let's think about the perspective of the prophet for a second. So I'm just going to tie into what the prophet says. In the beginning of the story, the prophet constantly tries to interact with the woman through his servant. He asked the servant, what does she need? Okay. When there's a problem with the child, the prophet says, Gehazi, why don't you go and you see what you can do with the staff? What is the problem with that interaction? It's not personal. because it's not personal directly between Elisha and the person he's trying to help, because he doesn't have a direct connection with the person he's helping, a direct connection, that represents the fact that he doesn't have a direct emotional connection to her. So he doesn't really understand her state of being. And because he doesn't really understand her state of being, that is why he gives her that blessing without her without her being ready to receive it. So that's one element. Now, so far we basically, I don't want to say it so harshly, but we basically said the reason why the problem with this miracle, the reason why the child, why the child did not survive is because of the problem of the woman. The woman wasn't grateful. But in some sense, what we're really saying, the problem is with Elisha. Why? First of all, he gave the blessing in a premature way, but also, why didn't he stick around and find out how the child is doing? If you read the story, you see that it jumps abruptly from the child was born until he's old enough to go out to his father in the field. What happened in that period? Usually in the story, when there are other stories in the Torah where somebody has a child miraculously, for example, Hannah has a child, Samuel. She takes him to the temple, to Eli, to the priest, and Eli raises the child. Why does Eli raise the child? Because the priest realizes that this is a special child born by the blessing of Eli. So Eli takes responsibility for this child's education. He takes interest. So Eli takes interest in Hannah's child. Elisha, we don't hear any interaction. He sort of gives the blessing, drops the bomb, and then he's out of the picture. He's not there to support her emotionally or to see how the lad is doing. And this may be why Elisha doesn't know what happens to the child. He's surprised. He says, God concealed it from me. He's surprised that God concealed it from him. In other words, that would mean that we would expect Elisha, if there's a problem with the child that came as a result of his blessing, we would expect Elisha, could be a few minutes, we would expect Elisha to have that insight. We would expect Elisha to have this insight, but Elisha does not have the insight. Why doesn't Elisha have the insight? Maybe because he didn't interest himself in this child, so he's emotionally separate from the child, therefore, he doesn't have the awareness of what happens to the child. And then what's the correction of that story? When he can't send his lad with his servant with his staff, but he has to go on his own and he has to lie on the child and breathe life into him, that represents an emotional connection between Elisha and the child. And that's the transformation. And if this is true, then perhaps the message is that it's not enough to help people. It's not enough to be there and give them what you think they need. If you're going to be a prophet, if you're going to be someone who's supporting other people, most important thing is you have to be there for them emotionally, not through a messenger. You have to be there for them emotionally. See what they need. See if they're ready for the blessing. Once you help them, make sure they're able to internalize this. Make sure to be there to support them, and then you have that connection. And then you would have that connection to the lad. So this story ultimately is a story of triumph, but the story of triumph happens through this development, both within the woman and within Elisha. So that's the story in short. There's a lot more to say. There are pages and pages and pages written on the story, but I think this is a small synopsis of one way of approaching the story. So today was a good day because we had the Kabbalah in the first half of the story. So if you're a Kabbalist, this is tremendously inspiring. If you like literature, also tremendously interesting. The second half of the class. So we have something for everybody, or you could just take both, or none, whatever you like.
I have a question. Actually,
yes.
One, you said if the story is true, do you buy the story?
No, I mean if my interpretation is true.
Okay.
If this interpretation is true, I haven't seen it. If it's written by the great sages, is one thing. It's contemporary rabbis interpreting this, so it may very well. I'm not saying it's not true, but it's interesting. It's very interesting to study the Bible that way and say, what's the message here? What is the development in the story from the beginning of the story to the end of the story, both within the woman and within the prophets? So to me, this is absolutely fascinating.
And
Yeah.
Hannah, didn't she say to him, "I'll bring my child to you"?
Yes. Yeah, because she recognized that this is a miracle and she felt grateful. And a sign of the gratitude is to bring the child to the temple to serve God, because that's a sign that she's grateful for the miracle. But this woman, we don't know anything. She doesn't bring him to the prophet. She doesn't say thank you. She doesn't make a party, nothing. What does that tell you? Maybe she wasn't emotionally ready for the child. But ironically, when do you become emotionally ready? When you lose it. Sometimes you don't appreciate something until you lose it. And that's when the transformation happens in the story.
Rabbi, I
Yes.
have a question about Elisha. If he's a true prophet, why didn't he consult with Hashem to begin with, to make sure that she indeed needs that child, and he just took it upon himself to but maybe there was a hidden blessing from Hashem, that she was supposed to get a child.
Right.
So what do you think of that? From the point of Elisha's development, if he's a true prophet, he should have consulted with Hashem, but maybe his prophecy was more like, maybe if she has a child, she would eventually appreciate him.
Right. So I want to say a few things on that. First of all, I don't know. I don't know Elisha's state of mind. But I'll tell you what Rashi says. Rashi says, why doesn't he consult with God? It's actually very interesting. Elisha does not pray to God until the child is dead. When he comes into the room, then he prays to God. The first time he doesn't pray to God, he just gives a promise. So Rashi says, how could a prophet give a promise? So Elisha says, Rashi says, I don't remember the exact words, but Rashi says something to the effect that Elisha was confident that God will perform the miracle. And he was so confident, and therefore he was willing to give the promise. Now, part of the development of the prophet is the interaction between the prophet and the recipient. It's a big problem for prophets. You always have Moshe and Aaron. And the problem with prophecy is that the job of the prophet is to convey the perspective of God, and not so much to focus on how the people are receiving it. In other words, not that it's not their job, it's not their inclination, right? The inclination of the prophet is, I'm here to convey the word of God. I'm here to do good. I'm here to superimpose good and wisdom and knowledge and inspiration. The danger of that is that the prophet doesn't realize that you can't just come and shower even blessings. The people have to be ready for it. And therefore, if you look at the first model of the prophet of Moshe and Aaron, Moshe was the one who brought the word of God. He was the man of truth. And Aaron was the man of peace. And the man of peace sometimes makes compromises. And sometimes Moshe and Aaron can't get along because their response to people is different. Aaron was all about making peace between people. And peace takes a certain compromise. And Moshe is not about compromise. Moshe is about truth. So the first generation, we had Moshe and Aaron as two different characters. But later, every prophet has to develop within themselves or cultivate within themselves both of these aspects. Both of the aspects of the prophet's job is to impose and to give, in the language of the Kabbalah, milamayla lamata, top down. But it's also the job of the prophet to help the people step up from below to above and help them internalize the blessing. So the answer is, why does Elisha not, Vicky's question is, why does Elisha just give a blessing without asking the person, without really emotionally connecting to the person? So the answer is, that's the temptation for the prophet. Now I'm going to make a joke. It's also the temptation of men. Men have this big problem that if you come to a man with a problem, they want to solve your problem. Now, usually you don't want them to solve your problem. What you want is the emotional connection. But men don't want to be there emotionally. It's hard for them. I'm generalizing, of course. So you tell a man, I had a hard day today. What you want is empathy. But what does the man give you? A solution. Oh, you had a hard day. Okay, so I'll order an Uber and you won't have to make supper. That's not the point. So there's a certain temptation when somebody feels like a giver. There's a certain temptation to give to solve the problem. But they're missing a truth that the problem is not really the problem. Solving the problem is not enough. You have to make sure that the other person feels understood and feels that you have a relationship and you have an emotional connection to them. And that takes time to develop. It takes time within people, but it even takes time within a prophet. And I would say perhaps that the prophet has a greater temptation to superimpose the blessing, to superimpose the will of God, because that's his job. And if you're a preacher or a prophet or a giver or a teacher or a principal, it's hard for you to realize that more than giving is holding back and letting the other person be ready for the blessing. If you see what I'm saying.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Vicky. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is a story in short. I enjoyed